This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 417A, side 1, November the 30th, 1979. And we've tucked almost the last month, next to the last month of the year away. Can't believe it's gone so fast, but this is the last week in November. Somebody asked me about the music that I've been playing on the tapes the last few weeks. This is from an album called Supertramp, Breakfast in America. A group of young people. It's from a song called Child of Vision. I gave you a rest in the past week about the Iranian crisis. I realized that we would be standing at a stalemate, and it was a good time to take a break because the events may escalate in the weeks to come. But we'll get back to it now and do part 2 on the Iranian crisis. Before I do, or opening into it, I want to mention 2 developments on the John Kennedy assassination. One took place in Fort Worth, Texas this last week. Michael Eddowes, the British author, had offered a $100,000 indemnification bond involving legal risks of exhuming Lee Harvey Oswald's body in Tarrant County in Fort Worth, Texas. He claims that's not Lee Harvey Oswald in the grave, and I support his contention. Not that it's a KGB spy, but that Oswald will not be there. In fact, there will not be a body in that grave when they dig it up, and that hearing takes place in April of 1980. I don't believe the courts in Tarrant County will allow that body to be exhumed, but they have already turned down an offer. He gave $15,000 deposit on an insurance bond for the exhuming of Lee Harvey Oswald, and that was turned down. I'm sure the other legal maneuvers will also be turned down. This last week we read about Suzanne Osgood, a knife-wielding woman from a mental hospital, always programmed from these strange mental hospitals, who went into the offices of Ted Kennedy with a knife and let out a blood-curdling scream and was stopped by the Secret Service. I don't know whether or not she was like Sarah Jane Moore and Squeaky Fromm with the assassination attempt of Gerald Ford, whether it was a real attempt or not. This is now the 3rd female almost assassin, or they're using women. This is a 38-year-old woman, an older woman like Sarah Jane Moore. A fellow researcher called me and thought it was a coincidence because of Lee Harvey Oswald to use an Osgood. I associated the name with Sandra Good. That's the roommate of Squeaky Fromm, a woman in jail now for trying to kill Gerald Ford. They're both members of the Manson family. Sandra Good and Suzanne Osgood sounded alike. Of course, in recounting the story that goes over the wire services, the media reminds you, after they write up about Suzanne Osgood, that John Kennedy was killed, the brother of Senator Ted Kennedy, by Lee Harvey Oswald, and Robert Kennedy was shot by Sirhan Sirhan. So that every time there are these attempts, whether they're real or not, or altercations, or somebody set in and then stopped, allowed to go so far and then stopped, the news then constantly rewards us with a reminder that Lee Harvey Oswald and Sirhan Sirhan were the assassins, while they actually have no physical evidence to link them to the murder through weapons or autopsies. But it's been 16 years, and that line still holds. I have to make an apology. I did a tape just this last week on the anniversary of John Kennedy's assassination. I think it was the first time in all the years since he was assassinated. I've been on the air. It's 8 years. This is my 8th year. And doing these tapes, that I actually forgot to do one tape in memory of that particular assassination. I was so caught up in the news of the week and so much material that I've learned since the death of John Kennedy and the realization that Kennedy is just one of so many, that the actual date didn't register on my mind until November 22nd, and I didn't even put it on the tape because it was just a part of the milieu of what we're living through now, and just let it pass up. But I did want to mention this Suzanne Osgood, and thinking of Sandra Good and Lee Harvey Oswald and Oswaldo, and the use of the similarity of these names. Maybe it's coincidental, and maybe it isn't. John Chamberlain had an article in Congressional Quarterly that was reproduced in the Washington Post. Senator Kennedy will confuse, and it puts down the policies of Senator Kennedy and how he would be, in quotes, weak or broken apart. And the article goes on to say that Mr. Brzezinski is managing to push Jimmy Carter into taking a tougher line with the communists, and Kennedy would appear too dovish by comparison, and we can't have dovishness with the Soviets. because there's a drive for the third world to get together and overpower the United States, that we need a strong position. Carter would be strong. Brzezinski is pushing Carter to the brink. Kennedy would be the center. He'd be too weak. And, of course, we have two choices. If the military's gone to all of this trouble to get in the position they are now, to get ready for World War III, what if Kennedy blew it? John Kennedy blew it for the Pentagon by pulling out of Cuba and not killing Fidel Castro and taking over Cuba, and they were afraid he would withdraw from the troops that he put in Southeast Asia as advisors, the Green Berets, and not have that war after he was elected in 1964. So either we are ready for a full-scale war that will keep Brzezinski and Carter and Kissinger and David Rockefeller in power, as I mentioned several weeks ago on the tape, or they have to kill Ted Kennedy and thus assure that Jimmy Carter would be reelected. Those are the only two choices I see now, a full-scale war or kill Senator Kennedy, or both. I can't believe that the Pentagon would go this far in doing all the dastardly things that they have done over the past years since World War I and then World War II, and then give it up because a few people wake up and go to the voting machines and say, I want to change. If you press the wrong button and they're out of power, they would give up too easily. They're not going to give up that easy, so that their only choices are to have several assassination attempts and then have Ted killed, or get us into that grand war right now. If you have the past tapes going way back, this is 2 years ago, just exactly November the 20th, not the 30th, almost 2 years ago to the week, tape number 296, Lydia Blades did a tape with me. It was the beginning of the meeting of Begin and Sadat, and the title of the tape listed in your list here, if you have it, is Peace in Middle East, the Politics of Sacrificing Libya, Iraq, and Syria. And this goes into the reasoning behind the United States and Sadat, or the Borman Brotherhood, combining with Begin, was to use the Sinai as a launching base against Iraq, Syria, and Libya that are leftist third world countries. Now, just this week, that's 2 years later, Mr. Begin is talking about using the Sinai area that we just gave to Egypt as a launching pad for a war in Iran, or to take these other countries. And Moshe Dayan was on television just yesterday morning talking on Good Morning America about the takeover of this Sinai area that he had said should belong to the United Nations or the United States, but which was turned to Egypt. And Moshe Dayan was agreeing that this piece of land could be used as a launching pad for war in the Middle East. I just can't believe that people such as Moshe Dayan from Israel, surrounded by enemies, wants the United States Army over there. And I always thought that Israel was being propped up by the United States as a military base, not as a country, not as a decent thing to do, but as a launching pad in case we needed all the Arab oil in the Middle East. So now they're talking about 11 countries that are off bounds that you shouldn't go to, that aren't safe, and 3 of those 11 are Libya, Iraq, and Syria, the 3 that we thought could be wiped out if we set up a confrontation and launched our army over there, just as we did in Southeast Asia, to take over the various countries there, assure our organized crime of the narcotics traffic of the Golden Triangle area. We would have the poppy traffic of the Middle East, so the organized crime and the Pentagon work hand in glove. And now we have our fleet warming up just in that section, as we predicted or thought it would be doing 2 years ago. In case you want to get more knowledgeable about the area that we're invading, and it always is interesting to do that. I don't think enough of us read the history of Cambodia or Laos or Thailand or Vietnam, the history of it, before we sent people over there to die and to kill and maim and poison. We didn't study the terrain. There are 2 books on Iran. One is called The Imperial Shah, an informal biography, and I'll give you this title on the printed sheet. It's put out by Little Brown and Company, and you can read about the Shah of Iran. There's even a better book out that came out in 1977 called The Crowned Cannibals, and it's about the Shah and his family, put out by Vintage Press in 1977. This book goes into a notorious Nazi general, Zahedi, and it tells about his links to Adolf Hitler in Iran and how his son was the ambassador from Iran to Washington, D.C. Now, over in Iran, the Mr. Zahedi, the father, was supplying dope, narcotics, and blackmail and prostitution and assassination teams to the Shah and to the Iranian government once the Shah was put in by our CIA, by Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, Richard Nixon. It names those various people, Mr. Schwarzkopf, General Schwarzkopf, who trained the Savak. He also was involved with the Lindbergh kidnapping and with Chappaquiddick, this particular Schwarzkopf. But this book talks about the Americans in 1953. Well, later Zahedi's son came over to be the ambassador of the United States, and he was supplying our congressmen with women and dope. And I mentioned on the other tape the blackmail that Khomeini has because they got this list from Zahedi. But the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And if you read The Crowned Cannibals, you'll get a little background on the lovely family of the Shah of Iran and the Pahlavi Foundation, and how it was set up and how the United States was involved in all our dirty tricks. And only by reading this can you understand how they feel about us over in Iran, that this isn't just a momentary indigestion they're having, but a genuine feeling based upon genuine facts. Good title, The Crowned Cannibals. Now, the Iranian crisis, of course, is developing into something very broad. And whenever a situation develops, whether it's the assassination of an individual or a Jonestown affair, I've learned to break down the subjects or the categories of the events as they take place almost immediately from the time the signal comes that this is going to be a big story or something to follow. I break these subjects into dividers or manila envelopes and then label them, and then articles that come out pertinent to those subjects, I file them into those sections as much as I can till my mind is set of the way the events are taking place. And I've given you a list here of 17 categories that I have for the Iranian crisis that I'm putting articles in or cross-filing. And I'm not going to cover all of those today with you. I'm just going to go over the classifications to show you how I'm following the events. And then today on the tape, I'm only going to talk about number one out of these 17 areas, because that is the most fascinating in my mind. Number one is the dilemma, the way we can't move. We're absolutely at a stalemate. The combine of Nelson Rockefeller, that chased Manhattan, Mr. Brzezinski, that Polish Nazi, and Henry Kissinger, the German Nazi, and Prince Bernhard from the Netherlands, remember the Gestapo. These people have cooked up a script to weaken the United States. The United States is going to be destroyed from within, and we've spread ourselves thin all over the world and built up these weapon systems while we're decaying inside. And the United States is falling apart, and the goal that was set for the 1,000-year Reich is working, and as we diversify our strength and look more ridiculous. And the point at which we fall apart fast or decay, it doesn't matter. It's happening all the time, and it's been going backwards, I think, since 1963, when John Kennedy was killed and the electoral process for all purposes was over. The least likely confrontation, the one that maybe they didn't anticipate to the full extent, that has broken open this conflict to something different than they figured, was the Ayatollah. The two unlikely adversaries, the USA versus the Ayatollah. I think the script was that if the Shah had to be out, they'd put an old man who was weak and unarmed and religious fanatic, halfway silly, temporarily on the throne, and let him set the country back to the Middle Ages with the women's costumes and their religious beliefs and their flagellations. And then when we arrived, they would welcome us with open arms. What happened was that the intense hatred for the United States is spreading around the world, and the latent hatred is similar to adolescence, when young adults begin to verbalize and get their legs and get their spending money and wheels, and then can tell their parents how much they've hated them for 15, 16, 17 years. I mean, they hated the pablum, the toilet train, the discipline, the going to bed, the selection of friends, the making them study boring subjects, the personalities, the alcoholism, the cruelties. All of that comes out in young adulthood because it's the first time that they really have the muscles, not only to run, but to kick and to give it back, and they give it back. And these countries are going right now into their real adolescence and youth and maturity, their awakening period. Their teacher has been the cassette machine, the FM radio, the newspaper, the alternative press, the music, the message in the music, which is so important. And while the Ayatollah has forbidden music, the music is one of the means by which the people have caught on and even learned to be sympathetic to what he was doing. He hasn't really understood the radical Western music and how it's changed people's minds all over the world. We didn't anticipate him as the man that we would have to confront, and now we're caught ahead of a world war that we had really planned, we weren't really ready for until 1985. We're caught with this wonderful figure, this Ayatollah Khomeini. So the dilemma, I call it the dilemma, and I'm going to talk about maybe as many articles as we can, the David and Goliath, the unlikely adversaries. Now, another section I have, which I say may do these things at other times, is articles on the Shah, the controversy, should he stand trial, what are the legal rights, giving up the $60 billion, the financial, will it break the banks of the United States and Chase Manhattan? Can we afford to say no, you can't have your money? The tying up of the money of the Shah himself personally. The Shah's illness, the excuse for the illness, the subterfuge, bringing him to this country until we're on the verge of war. When all the fleets are there, then he skips out. The Iranian money that's tied up in the United States, this is the controversy of the banks of Saudi Arabia, other countries with the United States, their insecurities in our financial bankruptcy, where we are right now in our economy. Then the oil cut off from the USA. We cut off the Iranian oil. They've cut off from us. What does this mean in terms of other countries cutting down their oil, squeezing us, raising prices? Oil as a weapon has now escalated for full scale. Then there's the Ramsey Clark, Dr. Yadsi Brzezinski connections. Ramsey Clark, I've never trusted him. He's a snake in the grass, and he was instigating and provoking the Ayatollah Khomeini, get your money back from the Shah. He is the Ayatollah what Mark Lane was to Jim Jones in whipping up a frather, and because Congressman Ryan was coming down there and everybody had to be killed so that we would know the extent of the mind control and the program that was going on in Guyana. Ramsey Clark is a provocateur disguised as a leftist, even not really disguised at all, whipping up the Ayatollah to a point that he went for it, but then he ended up with the spontaneous support of his people, and he had the good sense not to see Ramsey Clark when he realized what was happening. The Ayatollah is pretty smart. He wouldn't see a representative of the Pope. He wouldn't see Ramsey Clark. He wouldn't even see the PLO representatives, Arafat, or any of them, because he knows how dangerous they all can be, and he's standing alone, literally alone, with the people, and the people all over the world must be watching him. Then the David Rockefeller, Kissinger, John J. McCloy, the Chase Manhattan, Middle East oil connection. So that is a category of itself on how they've manipulated us, you know, from the end of World War I and then World War II, and now these dogs are in a bind. The world attention is focused upon them for the first time like it's never been before. And even though Jimmy Carter comes out and takes the blame for Henry Kissinger, he is their man, and we'll go a little more into that dilemma. But this team handpicked the President of the United States so that an outside country is saying, do something. The world is saying, doing something. But Jimmy Carter is Henry Kissinger, John J. McCloy, David Rockefeller. They picked him. They picked Jimmy Carter as their president. So we're not really talking to a man, even if it was Richard Nixon, who was in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, a vice president and a president. He represented a cross-section of the American people. If he's rotten, we're rotten. If Gerald Ford was in the House of Representatives, whether he's on the Warren Commission or a short while a vice president or president, he was a part of the milieu of the fabric of America. If he's corrupt, we're corrupt. But he was a part of the whole of America. Now, that's a little different thing. Even Lyndon Johnson served his years in the House of Representatives and went every year and stood up to re-election, even if some of the opponents might have died along the way. The corruption is America. Corruption is American politics. But there's still a fine line of difference between Jimmy Carter, who was an Annapolis admiral, graduated from the Navy School, similar to Haig, who went to West Point, handpicked by Kissinger and Brzezinski, the two protégés. There's a difference because you can't appeal to the President of the United States. When he gets up there and speaks, you're not listening to the President, you're listening to Chase Manhattan. You're listening to David Rockefeller. If that bank goes bankrupt, if the oil interests are jeopardized, he is David Rockefeller. He is Brzezinski. He was selected when he was in Europe. He was groomed for 2 years by Brzezinski. He doesn't have a foreign policy. As governor of Georgia, he had no foreign policy. Jimmy Carter is the Pentagon. He's the Navy intelligence. He is Brzezinski, Kissinger, and David Rockefeller. He isn't the President of the United States. So when he gets up, he's like Pinocchio in the hands of the puppeteer. When you hear him speak, he's cool and calm. He is them, and he can't separate himself from their interests, and he would put us in a war if it's what they want. If they want a war, we'll have a war. And that is what Jimmy Carter is, and you can't confuse his position. The Khomeini can't appeal to him as a person when he's a puppet. Jimmy Carter's team put the Shah of Iran into office. They made the Savak. They trained the Savak. So you can't expect him to send the Shah back or to send the money back or to be objective about the whole game. Number 9 is Ayatollah Khomeini, his leadership as a person, his background, his charges that the embassy was a spy center. What he objects to is the documents that millions of dollars were being sent in by Chase and Rockefeller and Brzezinski and those people to overthrow his government just before they took the embassy. They have this proof, and they want to try these people as spies. That they are not. They're just as delegates or persons as being entertained in a country, guests of that country in the United States Embassy. He says they were there to overthrow the existing government. Now, we have done this in embassies in 77 countries, but never have we been put to the test for that. That's what's so interesting about this whole thing, is that we're being put to the test, that our embassies are to overthrow governments. The people of Chile have not risen up yet. They don't have a leader yet. That tells them that we killed Allende so that Pinochet could take over, so that Goodrich Rubber and Dow Chemical and Chase Manhattan and ITT can rip and rape the country. That's what our embassy was there, to overthrow Allende and put in a person good for the multinational business. The next section 10 is on the hostages themselves, their physical condition, their releasing, articles about them being brainwashed, and CIA articles about the hostages. The next is about provocateurs. Whenever we want to prove a certain point in this country, we set up incidences such as the alleged kidnapping of the governor in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Later those charges were dropped. There was a bomb that was supposed to be on a plane put by Iranians. All of a sudden that's hushed up. There was an airplane that was hijacked in Texas, and the man said, "Take me to Iran." All of this is to get talk on stations like KGO radio on the West Coast or on the East Coast or all around the country, foment anti-Iranian feeling. They're kidnapping our public officials. They're bombing our airplanes. They're hijacking us to Timbuktu. All of this is whipped up, and yet there is no evidence that these people really were part of an Iranian establishment that is pro-Khomeini. It's more agent provocateurs, the kind that Richard Helms could set up in the Central Intelligence Agency before he became the ambassador to Iran. The next section, I have a big section, of course, are the war threats, the threats of Jimmy Carter to go to war, the articles on the war, the maneuvers of the fleet, the media begging for war, the war plans, and the bays and where they are, where the ships are. The next section is on solutions. What are they going to try? The choices of articles on the United Nations, on Representative George Hansen. Of course, the establishment is furious with Hansen. Here's a staunch conservative who is very much part of our establishment in the Congress of the United States, who flew over on his own and came back and said, put David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger in there for the hostages. That's outrageous. That made Jimmy Carter jump off the walls to think of that. And, of course, he would get congressmen to object. But Hansen got a view of what was going on, and I commend him for his courage. He crossed the party line from being what was a blind conservative, just holding the party line, let's go to war and get him, to jumping the ocean at his own expense to see what was going on. That's what we need, our people to see for themselves what's going on and to talk to the hostages themselves. Then we had that Pakistan embassy where 2 Americans were killed. Very low-key, no mention of that. We're not going to war with Pakistan. The president of Pakistan is still our friend. We need Pakistan, and it's very interesting how low-key. Nobody's been killed in Iran, and we say if one person is killed, we go to World War III. But 2 people were killed in Pakistan, and that's nothing at all. Then articles on the Iranians in the USA, the deportation, the demonstrations, the job losses, beating up in the Santa Rosa prison, the housing and the attacks. Then an important section is the Arab response from other nations and the taking of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Now, I'll be adding to the Iranian conflict, but within that category, the most important articles I have fit into that section. And, of course, it is the dilemma that interests me, that is so fascinating, to see America with its back against the wall. Now, why would I be so glad to see that, an American citizen, happy that America is against the wall? Well, personally, I'm ashamed of America. Many of you know I was planning to leave this country in 1970. That was just almost 10 years ago, and 2 weeks before the end of the year, December the 14th, my daughter, Bonnie, was killed in an automobile crash, and my other daughter, Barbara, was almost killed. We had applied for citizenship in Canada, and we're about to leave the country. And because of that, we were forced to rearrange our family and the circumstances, and Barbara had to have surgery the next year and had lots of injuries on her body, and the chances of going to Canada then were put off, and we stayed in the United States. And then Watergate broke, and I wrote my story, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And then I began radio work and began to expose the evils of the system of this government at home. If I was going to stay here, I would work here and do that instead of running away and leading another kind of life in Canada. Because if my alternative is that I have to stay here, I wasn't going to stay here and keep my mouth shut. I've seen the United States do so many terrible things all over the world since World War II in so many countries that I was ashamed of this country, and I also felt that my children would not be safe in this country, because someday the world is going to rise up against the United States and put all the crimes that we did in front of us for a full view, and we're going to have to account for ourselves, just as they're asking the Shah of Iran to account for himself. If he took money out of those countries, we've drained every country. We've set up torture, assassination teams, and so forth. And I really felt in 1970 that we would be leaving early in 71, and the accident took place in December of 1970. And after a year of recuperating and being just with the family and getting over that tragedy, I got back to my work, and as I say, I have stayed with it ever since, because I think we are going to pay our dues, and the sooner we exposed our own crimes and admitted them and went forward, the better we would be psychologically and the healthier we'd be as a country. It didn't work that way for most people. They didn't think that way, and now the country is bankrupt, and we can read many articles about the United States emotionally and psychologically bankrupt because we did not concert our effort to expose what was happening around the world that we as Americans were doing to other people in terms of lives and pain and depletion of their money and grabbing the profits for the handful of a few American businesses here. It didn't get distributed among the people, but even if it did, it wouldn't have been right. The ripping off and raping of countries all over the world and putting in these treacherous dictatorships. As I say, I was embarrassed by it. I hated it. I hate it now. And the only way I can face myself in this world today, as I've done in the past, is to do what I'm doing to try to set the record straight so we can go forward. They don't have to read a list of the crimes we've done. I see a litany of it every single day in every newspaper. On the other side of this tape, I'm going to share some of the articles that have been coming out on what I call the dilemma of the United States versus the Ayatollah Khomeini. Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 417B, side 2, November the 30th, 1979. And we'll do some more on the Iranian crisis as a part 2 on the Iranian crisis. There are so many precedents taken in this act of the Ayatollah Khomeini against the United States that it's hard to list all of them. There's so many that come to my mind, but one is when he's asking back for the $56.5 billion, a suit against the Shah. I think of what happened when the war in Vietnam was over and Premier Thieu couldn't leave because the plane was so heavily loaded with solid gold. They had to repack the airplane, and Premier Thieu went down to Southern California, and it seems that the officials in Vietnam took out extreme wealth. And then after the war was over, they were bankrupt, and the Western world said, see, you can't make it, you're no better than when we were there, you're bungling it. They were left without any money. When the Tsar's family left Russia, when the revolution came, the wealth, gold, billions and billions of dollars were taken into Manchuria and drained out of the country so that the peasants, when they finally took over with the revolution, the Bolsheviks, the wealth was gone. All of the money was taken out of Germany at the end of World War II and taken to South America, Central America, Middle East, and Asia. And, of course, the United States had to invest and put money back, our own money back over there to rebuild Germany so we could watch and have a bulwark against Russia another time around. But the money taken out leaves the host country totally bankrupt, and then the other countries can sit back and say, well, see, you can't do any better than we did. And the truth is that they don't have the capital to do it with. And here is Khomeini asking for the money back because he says, we're bankrupt. You took $56.5 billion, give it back to us, and give us a chance to do with that money what you did, and see if we don't do a better job than you did. Instead of buying jewels and gold and diamonds, give it back and let us put into agriculture equipment. And that's what we need, and grow our own food instead of importing it, which the Shah forced them to do. I don't know how many of you saw a speech by Khomeini last week. It's titled, "The World is Not on Our Side," and it was reproduced in the New York Times. It's a very important speech because he talks to Jimmy Carter and refers to him as a man who's an oppressor, and he says that he has a psychological disease that we in America have, he refers to it as a psychological illness. This disease has caused you to regard the great masses of the world as not belonging to the world. Khomeini said Mr. Carter himself and other people like him, maybe number 50,000 out of the entire world, the rulers, the ruling class, the people who have their hands on the weapons and on the capital, are 50,000 people. But Khomeini said that these 50,000 people don't see the various stratas of society, which are compared to oceans. He says that Jimmy Carter and those kind of people are only droplets, that they have a disease of self-glorification in which they can't see what other people feel. And Khomeini said that Carter intimidates us with military threats and economic threats, but he's beating an empty drum. It won't work. And he quoted Winston Churchill, who in the last war said, victory belongs to those who sit on a wave of oil. Khomeini says, you plundered us, you took away our oil, you gave us guns and rifle, but these weapons were for your sake. We don't need them. He claims we don't need them at all. And he said, America needs oil, and you gave us all these things just to maintain your power here. He doesn't want those weapons. He wants to cancel those debts. Khomeini went on to say, if the world is what it is, and if it consists of the oppressed people, if the world reality is that the oppressed people run the world and the oppressors offer nothing except corruption, if that is the world, then the world is not on your side. This world does not approve of a president who claims to be a champion of human rights and who creates so much evil for humanity and kills so many people, Khomeini told Jimmy Carter. And he again referred to the psychological illness which Carter has, and that he equates spies as diplomats. He says spies are not diplomats. He said the heads of countries who act like this towards other nations, who act like this towards the oppressed people, should change their minds, and that you can't send people over and call them diplomats when they're nothing but spies. And he goes on to say, Khomeini said, people have changed. They're not the same people you think they were, and that you're dragging us towards destruction because you don't understand what people think and you want them to submit to you. The name of the lead article reproduced in the newspaper is "The World is Not on Your Side." Now I'd like to share just a few of the lead articles because the Brahu of "We'll go to war if one person is killed" scares a lot of people, and there are a lot of good writers pointing out some of the problems we're facing, and I call this our dilemma. Peter Costa, United Press, wrote an article, "Change is drastic, the future is uncertain, a decade of disillusionment ending on a question mark." And he goes into the computers are smaller, the mortgages are bigger, the automobiles are shorter, oil has increased 700% in the last 10 years, the face of the future is uncertain. The only thing that was certain about this whole thing, as I mentioned several weeks ago, is that the pendulum has to swing, and this putting in of military dictatorships can't work forever. Even if we have a total world dictatorship, it'll fall apart at the seams. Another article by Robert G. Kaiser from the Washington Post. I'm reading you not sentences from the articles, mostly just the top headline of each of these stories to show you the tone of what's coming out across the country. This article is called "A Painful Close to a Difficult Decade for America." And he also notices that 10 years ago in 1970, Richard Nixon was making a bombing appeal and bombing Cambodia, and this was his quotation, "If when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions throughout the world." End quote. Richard Nixon was wrong. When a giant nation acts like a bully, we will fall apart eventually because we have no substance, no morals, no intellectual integrity, no appreciation or love of other nationalities and people to back up our right to be in their country. We're nothing but ripping them off. And this article has a cartoon in the corner of one picture of Khomeini and another picture of John Wayne, and the opposition of the Iranians holding Khomeini's picture and the hard hats with John Wayne, and it's called "A Painful Close to a Difficult Decade." Another article, interesting article, in the San Jose Mercury, a reprint from the United Press International and the Washington Post, "Hostages 22nd Day, No Let-Up in Sight," and another article, "A Hinge in History," and this is by Don Oberdorfer. Fascinating article on history of what is happening, and it goes into the fact that 3 weeks after the seizure of the embassy, the international events are hinging on a way that the government has to make a decision on the way to act, and it will alter the course of history. He says America is looking beyond the draining demands of day-to-day maneuvers and is just beginning to look beyond the tactical situation to the broader repercussions. We're substantial in numbers. We have 141 embassies, 142 consulates, but they could be thrown over. Many of them, the article says, are in areas of instability where host governments are not always friendly. We didn't bring up our children to think that anybody disliked us, and now we read that 141 embassies in areas of instability, and the host government is not always friendly to us. And the article goes into the dilemma, and we are at a historical point here. We're small, we have a lot of arms, but we're weak. We have put in a man, the Shah of Iran, who we knew was corrupt, we knew was murderous, gave him the instruments to murder, let him put all that money into American banks because it's good for business. We need oil, we don't need another war, we can't afford to antagonize the Muslims. We're even asking the Soviet Union to help us. It's the first time that we can't say to them, look, the Soviets are behind this, we've got to go in and save the world from communism. We're appealing to the Soviets, for goodness sakes, help us here, we're stuck. You help us. And Spain came out this last week and said, if you have a war over in the Middle East, you cannot use our soils to fight. Imagine we put in Franco and gave them their fascism and put in that government into power, and they're saying, if you're going to go to war, don't count on us for anything in terms of land basis. They came out. The hinge in history, the fact that the way history is being altered on the day-to-day level, is that this article was written after 22 days when the men were hostages, but every single day that it goes on, The entire world is learning more about the Shah of Iran. This article also brings up the fact that book, The Crash of '79, that contemplated a financial crash based on the manipulation of Iranian assets. You see, the money that's tied up in our American David Rockefeller banks, the links of Rockefeller to Carter, makes an interesting dilemma. The United States is searching for the bottom of the barrel for legal rules because we have to act very, quote, legally or gentlemanly in this situation. Another interesting article, the U.S. is searching for legal remedies in the Iran crisis. Where do we go to? That Khomeini has said that diplomats shouldn't be spies. We know they are, but he's called attention to our agencies, and everybody will be watching our embassies. One of the funniest articles, and I always can find something funny even in tragic news, was the article from the New York Times, November 23rd, on legal remedies for Iran, and it tells how they were looking up our old treaties with Iran and the International Court of Justice that is held at The Hague, and how we should appeal to the International Court and what we can take before the United Nations. And in this article it mentions that they even got some legal scholars from the government who told the administration that there was a crisis, an incident in Prague in 1618 rather, when two diplomats of the Holy Roman Empire were thrown out of a window by nobles of the government of Bohemia, and that incident touched off the 30-year war. So maybe if two hostages are thrown out of the embassy in Iran, maybe that'll set off our next 30-year war. But it's an interesting thing that in looking for legal precedents to an emotional thing where these people are starved, they're sitting with billions of dollars of guns they don't need, they need food, they need agriculture and housing, education and health and high inflation. The Shah's ripped them out of everything. Our scholars have to go back to the year 1618 to look for some legal justification for the next move, when actually the answers are so simple and practical. James Reston comes in with an article on November the 14th, Where Are the Allies? Well, where does he think they are? He says that the niceties of normal diplomatic procedures are not working in Tehran. James Reston, like the whole New York staff that pawned off the Lee Harvey Oswald story and all the other lies through the century, along with Henry Luce and those creeps, how can he expect us to have allies when we rip these people off and they're insecure and they know their own heads are going on the axe? It's like the French Revolution when the heads are falling. Where do they think the allies are going to come from, and who's going to speak up? Another article in the Washington Post by Jonathan Randall, Crisis Worsened by Appeals to Home Audiences. And this article is very interesting because as the Iranian crisis goes, Khomeini can reach more people and get his point across, and Jimmy Carter is trying to reach his people through the media. And this article compares, it says the differences involve a superpower, the United States, worried about becoming a pitiful, helpless giant, and a genuinely revolutionary regime seething and long-suppressed national resentment that will rally support by playing David to America's Goliath. That is what I call the dilemma category, and it said that Iran's decision to no longer accept dollars in payment for its oil could be the beginning of the end of Americans' currency. That this oil transaction is very dangerous for America, and that Japan and Europe will be suspicious. They quote the heads of the Iranian government and Bani Sadr, saying that if my strategy succeeds, Japan and Europe will become the economic center of the world, not the United States. And that is exactly what Brzezinski and Kissinger brought us into, that Japan and Germany and the Netherlands are now the economic center of the world and not the United States. And the conflict of the Iranians denouncing American behavior for third world countries, and knowing that Europe and Japan can get strong through all this, this article goes on, the crisis is worsened as the home audience watches David and Goliath. There's another article, I have about 70 here, I can't put on one side of a tape, but we'll run through as many as we can. The Real Danger of Being Soft on Iran, and this is by George Will. The U.S. displays its impotence, and it could speed the world slide into anarchy. Well, all of these editorialists have been apologists for these assassinations, for the rip-offs, for the military dictatorships. What they don't see is that the anarchy is coming because we've had policies with no thought, better dead than red, Get the Russians at any cost. Don't build up these countries. Rip them off, whether it's Guyana or Brazil or Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Laos, Cambodia, you name it, Philippines, South Korea. Take them and rip them. The anarchy is coming because at the end of World War II, where we had a chance to sit down with the major nations in the Soviet Union and China and decide how we would keep from rearming Germany and Japan and make a decent world for everybody, we got into spreading anarchy by spreading weapons, and now the weapons can be used against us. Another article, an editorial in the New York Times, the pressure on the Ayatollah. The plight of the American hostages in Iran is a painful reminder of the vulnerability of the most powerful nation on earth. Of course we're vulnerable. They're crying in their beer, but every single one of these guys hasn't written a decent editorial. In the 16 years I've been studying the political science of this country, I call this crying over their beer. Another article from London, Ayatollah's action spurs worldwide indignation. And then you read the quotations, and the world everywhere isn't that outraged in the editorials. This article says from London, many editorials say the United States shouldn't try to use military force. Military action probably would not save the lives of the hostages, but it would certainly lead to a conflict that would affect not only the oil production of the entire Mideast, but the political position of the United States in that very region for a long time to come. That's coming out of Munich, Germany. If Europe and Japan are cut off from their oil and Canada cut off from their oil, they're not going to thank Brzezinski, Kissinger, and David Rockefeller, who are cooking this little thing up for themselves to save the money in the Rockefeller banks and to assure their prestige in the Middle East. It's going to boomerang against us, and we'll become more corrupt and more bankrupt, if possible, as each day follows. Marvelous article by Mike Royka from the Chicago Sun. Let's all get together and hate the nasty Iranians, it's called. And it tells about all the radio talk shows whipping up the vigor about them, but it said people will go looking for a Persian patrol. They may find Armenians, Albanians, Turks, Greeks, and even dark-haired Americans who went for winter suntans that will end up beating up everybody. And we don't know one person from another. We've got them all confused. And then the article goes on about Henry, Dr. Strangelove Kissinger, David Bottom Line Rockefeller, and how the White House let in the Shah of Iran to set this whole confrontation up. And Reika goes on, his last sentence in the article says, I wish I knew more about international law because I sometimes wonder if using our Central Intelligence Agency to put deadly dictators in charge of other countries is even a misdemeanor. See, we're talking about law when we have actually killed Shambe in the Congo and Lumumba, tried to kill Fidel Castro, killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Whitney Young. We've raped this country. Labor leaders, Mr. Yablonsky, Walter Reuther, Saul Alinsky, we've raped, killed, and we're talking about staying within the boundaries of the law. We're ridiculous, and even the editorials now are bringing this out. Mike Royka had another good article Thursday, November 29th, also from the Chicago Sun. Americans can't stand the stalemate in Iran. The TV-induced hysteria that's going on, that it's a countdown of days, it's a time bomb. Our ships are moving in, and we can't stand it. What we also can't stand is the fact that as it goes on, as I say, the point is getting crossed of more and more the demands and the anger and the hatred towards America. And hatred could be contagious if you're starving. As I mentioned before on a tape 2 weeks ago, when Khomeini says, we haven't anything to lose because we're slaves and we're broke, only you, Mr. Carter, have something to lose in the United States. Royka writes again, America can't stand the stalemate. Chicago Sun-Times by Bruce Ingersoll had an article, Despite military might, Carter can't make a move, and it tells how powerless we are to rescue these people, and that putting the Navy in between the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean can block off oil that Japan and Western Europe need and import from Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other countries, and that we couldn't even bring in a rapid deployment force of 100,000 from Fort Bragg. The commander-in-chief of this superpower can't move. They compared him to Lemuel Gulliver, the hero of Gulliver's Travels, and the Lilliputians pinned him down. We can't make a decision one way or the other. It's a dangerous move, and we are held at a standstill by the Ayatollah. John P. Wallace from the Los Angeles Examiner, from Washington Bureau. These are the lead articles. Again, the U.S. faces tough choices over Iran. It goes into the embargo of shipments, the rationale, and the appealing to the Soviet Union, and the fear that if we went to war, Pakistan has said that they would side with Iran, with the Soviet Union, Iraq, and Afghanistan come in. These are the unknowns. Will we get the war with the Soviet Union if we enter into Iran, because they know it's a launching base for World War III against the Soviet Union, with the missiles being put all over Europe, the atomic missiles. Just a few weeks ago, this was decided by NATO that we would have them all aimed at 7 countries, including West Germany, against Russia. So I am sure that if we land a troop over in the Middle East, the Soviet Union isn't going to like that very much, and may be forced to move swiftly before we're ready for the next war. They're not going to let us land in Iran and set that up as a launching base this time. Another article, San Francisco Examiner, an editorial, The Lapse of Civilization in Iran, and it talks about Shah and how we're, having a poor man suffering from a disease, and Khomeini's out of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages had its dark black periods, and then we also had the Renaissance and a build-up. We have cycles of awareness. We had the French Revolution, the kings and queens of the French court, the French Revolution, the American Revolution. There was the Tsar of Russia and all the jewels and the classical, the music and the culture and the arts, and they were barbarians. Civilization always seems to be lapsing when the people come forward and demand to be fed and housed and clothed, and we call that a lapse of civilization when the people rise up. The civilization and culture is supposed to be in the hands of those 50,000 that Khomeini was talking about. Anything less than that are barbarians. Freedom fighters, or studying these various revolutions, like the American Revolution, we have a holiday and we celebrate the fact that we put off the British and took things in our own control. But in Africa or the Middle East or in South America, they're called guerrillas. 3 guerrillas were killed today, 4 guerrillas were killed today. I can't figure out why various civil rights leaders haven't asked the media. They don't talk about niggers or kikes or derogatory terms that we used to use to describe various people. I don't understand why the blacks and the Chicanos or Mexicans or Africans have allowed the word guerrilla to be used by the media instead of saying 4 soldiers were killed on this side, 4 soldiers on that side. It's just as noble to fight for your freedom and for your children and the right to eat and the right to not have disease or the right to have health and home. That's just as noble as to fight to maintain the Queen's crown or the Shah's gold telephone or the Shah's gold toilet. So that civilization, by definition, is in the hands of those 50,000 and everyone else is a guerrilla. It was an editorial in the Washington Post by Skip Stiles called Distant Thunder, and it tells about his father, a military man, and the technologies of our Department of Defense. And he describes that our strategy 10 years ago, again, of turning those rice stores into ashes. And he makes the remark that 10 years ago we turned in Cambodia rice stores into ashes and dumped 17 million gallons of defoliants over in Vietnam. War is not clean, and how do you think the world feels it rises up and reacts to 17 million gallons of defoliants? What happened was that our own men came home and were poisoned. Their children have cleft palates and club feet and spinal weaknesses and deformities and mental diseases. And the very GIs that went over to fight, the ones that weren't killed, came home, and those that are having children are having problems with these children. The diseases came back with us partfold, and wait till the chickens come home to roost and we really feel the effect of all the germs and chemicals and diseases and war diseases, what we've done to the minds of people and the bodies of people. The wanting of a war now and bringing those troops to solve this problem just shows that a handful of people still, like Khomeini said, are mentally diseased. They're mentally sick to keep continuing this game. The New York Times had an editorial November the 14th, "In Iran, a sea of troubles." The problem with the British government and their hold of the petroleum, and then turning the petroleum over to Exxon, Texaco, Standard Oil, and Mobil, and the use of the Gulf there, and the complications of getting ourselves involved in Iranian war. Another article, unanimous sympathy for the United States expressed by the United Nations. And then there was an article by a member from Guinea-Bissau, and a quotation. I looked to see how unanimous it was, and there were just a couple of countries quoted there. The headline says unanimous, but the general had the feeling that if this war goes on, nobody is safe. It was an article, the lead article says that there's always two sides to every issue and that people are behind us, but when you read the article, it's hard to find a unanimous feeling there. Another article sent out to the media, outrage at Iran, the world backs Carter's stand. And then I read the article to see who's behind Jimmy Carter, and the first country mentioned is South Africa, the outrage of this. Well, South Africa, Israel, and Iran were very close buddies, and it'd be natural that they would be quoted. And then there's a quotation from an official from Tanzania, his feelings about Iran. So again, the South Africa or Tanzania or the quotation from Guinea-Bissau doesn't mean the whole world. Another article, Americans unlikely to mount a raid on Iran. It talks about the military options and the impotence of the United States that we probably can't go in. Article in the San Jose Mercury, Santa Clara University professor says, United States should keep cool. He said, I don't think threats to cut off food and threats to invade are of any use. This is a professor named David Skinner. Those threats simply indicate to traditional Muslim society a failure of spiritual values on the part of the United States. We will not accept responsibility for what we did over there, and when they point it out, we say we won't buy your oil, we won't send you food, we'll close up the money that you have in the United States. And this professor, who's an expert on the Middle East, said these things won't work, and I'm afraid they won't work in other countries too. They'll learn to become self-sufficient and not rely on the United States because they see us and how we react at a time of anger. There's another article about Lebanon and the Shiite Muslims inspired by Khomeini in Iran. This is a long article from the Washington Post, November 13th, 1979. The Shiite Muslims inspired by Iran, a new Arab force. And it tells about them getting together and all of a mind, a resurgent mind, and an awareness of what is going on and the desire to link with Khomeini, that the Muslims in Beirut and Lebanon are a strong group, 900,000 members in this area, and that they would link up with Khomeini and that they're sympathetic to him, and we better not get too involved in the Persian Gulf because we may have more than we really want to face if these various people get together. It may become contagious and we'd be blocked off completely from the Middle East. Another article, the New York Times, November the 15th, Arabs facing new doubts on investments of oil money. President Carter's decision to freeze official Iranian assets will force major oil exporters to reconsider the wisdom of accumulating surplus fund in Western economies. Arab money has gone into farms and farmland and real estate all over the United States. If they begin to unload that and ask for their cash back, we'd be in pretty hard straits. And this article suggests that they may invest it in other countries. If it's going to be tied up here, they feel insecure. These are treacherous times. When we dropped the atomic bomb in Japan, many people said we won the war, but we lost the peace. You can't wage war without oil, and you can't win oil countries by bombing and destroying the oil that belongs to another country. We can't protect our future or our embassies. We can't protect our soldiers or people that go around overthrowing other countries. The only solution to this thing is to examine ourselves, to admit our errors, apologize for the past, and don't repeat the mistakes. That's an idealistic approach. It won't happen. As a nation, it can happen to us as people, as individuals. We have to act intelligently and intellectually to a complicated problem and not respond like spoiled people with a bat beating up the rest of the world. That's the only way we can live our lives from day to day and have any sanity. Well, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. I'll be back with you next week. There's lots of news. Keep well and take care. Have a good week.